The first time I noticed it was on a Wednesday, or maybe a Thursday. The days blur together when you work the kind of hours I work. I'm a night auditor at a place called the Saguaro Inn, a 32-room independent motel off Highway 191 in southeastern Arizona, about halfway between Wilcox and the New Mexico border. The job title sounds more official than it is. What I actually do is run the front desk from 11 at night to 7 in the morning, process the day's financials, balance the folios, handle any late arrivals, and make sure the building doesn't burn down before the morning crew shows up. It's accounting with a master key. I'd been doing it for about 5 months when the pattern started, or 5 months before I recognized it. Those might be two very different timelines, but I can only speak to what I know. The Saguaro Inn is the kind of motel that doesn't show up on booking apps. We're in one aggregator, a regional one that covers small properties in southern Arizona and New Mexico, and that's about it. Most of our guests are repeat travelers, people driving the 191 corridor regularly for work, long-haul types who know the road, snowbirds cutting through in winter. We get the occasional family who missed a turn and needs a bed, or a couple who didn't want to push all the way to Lordsburg in the dark. But overwhelmingly, our guests are people who already know we exist. You don't find the Saguaro by accident. The property is laid out in a U-shape, 2 wings extending back from the office, with a courtyard in the middle that has a drained pool and some dead landscaping the owner keeps saying he'll replace. The office is at the front, facing the highway. Behind the office is a short hallway that leads to the laundry, a storage closet, and the back exit. Each wing has 16 rooms, numbered 101 through 116 on the east side and 201 through 216 on the west. The rooms all open onto exterior walkways that face the courtyard. There's no interior hallway. You walk outside to get to your room, which means I can see most of the doors from the office if I step into the courtyard, and I can see the rest on the camera system. The cameras are old but functional, 6 of them, 1 over the office entrance, 1 at the end of each wing, 1 covering the parking lot, 1 on the back exit, and 1 pointed at the courtyard from the roof of the east wing. They feed into a DVR unit in the back office that records on a 72-hour loop. The footage is grainy, black and white at night, and the frame rate is low enough that fast movement turns into a smear. But for a motel this size, it's adequate. You can see who comes and goes. The night audit itself is straightforward. I close out the day's transactions at midnight, run the reports, post room charges, verify the cash drawer, check the rate codes, and file the paperwork for the morning manager, Gerald. Gerald is in his 60s. Former military, runs the place for an absentee owner in Phoenix. He's precise and humorless and expects the same from his staff. The paperwork I leave him every morning is meticulous because Gerald will find any error, and he will bring it to my attention in the tone of a man who considers clerical mistakes a personal failing. My other duties between midnight and 7 are minimal. Walk the property once at 1 a.m. and once at 4 a.m., handle any guest calls or complaints, restock the lobby coffee station at 5, put out the breakfast items at 6:30, keep the log updated. The log is a lined composition notebook that Gerald insists on. He doesn't trust the computer system for overnight notes. Every call, every check-in, every noise complaint, every maintenance issue, every time I walk the property, I write it down with a timestamp. Gerald reads it every morning before he reads anything else. He told me during training that the log is how he knows whether his night auditor is actually working or sleeping in the back office. The log tells the truth even when people don't, he said. I've kept it faithfully every shift.
So that's the job, that's the building, that's the routine. I'm telling you all of this because when I describe what started happening, I need you to understand that I know this motel. I know its sounds, its rhythms, its normal malfunctions. I know which ice machine cycles too loud at 3 a.m. and which hallway light flickers when the temperature drops below 50. I know how the front door sounds when it opens, and I know how the parking lot gravel sounds under tires, and I know the difference between a coyote outside the fence and a guest walking to the vending machine. 5 months of overnight shifts in a quiet building teaches you its language. What I started noticing wasn't a misunderstanding, it was a fluency. The property management system we use is called InLedger. It's old, DOS-based, green text on a black screen. Runs on a dedicated terminal behind the front desk that probably hasn't been updated since the mid-2000s. When a guest checks in, the desk clerk creates a folio: name, ID, vehicle, plate number, room assignment, rate, payment method, estimated checkout date. The folio gets a timestamp automatically when it's created. That timestamp is what I reconcile during the audit. I match every folio against the cash drawer, the key log, and the physical occupancy of the building. If the numbers don't balance, I find out why before I close the day. On a Wednesday night, or Thursday, I still can't remember, I was running the audit at about 12:15 a.m. when I noticed a folio I didn't recognize. It was for room 209, West Wing, 2nd floor. The folio showed a check-in timestamp of 2:14 a.m. That's the first thing that was wrong. It was 12:15 a.m. The folio was timestamped 2 hours in the future. InLedger doesn't let you manually set timestamps. The system generates them automatically based on the terminal clock, which syncs to the same NTP server Gerald set up years ago. You can't predate or postdate a folio. It stamps when you create it. And this one was stamped 2:14 a.m. on a night that hadn't reached 2:14 yet. The second thing that was wrong was that the folio had no name. The guest name field, which is required, InLedger won't let you save a folio without it, read only a single character, a period, just a dot, as if someone had typed the minimum possible input to get past the field validation and move on. Vehicle field, blank. Plate number, blank. Payment method, cash. Rate, 0. Estimated checkout, same date as check-in. The room assignment was 209, and the key log showed that the key for 209 had not been issued. It was still on the hook behind the desk. I checked. It was right there, hanging where it should be, tagged with its green plastic fob. I looked at the camera feed for the West Wing. Room 209 was dark, no vehicle in front of it, no light under the door, no sign anyone was there, or had been there. I figured it was a system error. InLedger is old enough that data corruption isn't unheard of. I'd seen it generate phantom charges before, ghost entries that showed up during the audit as artifacts of a crashed transaction or a power fluctuation. I deleted the folio, noted it in the log as a system anomaly, and moved on. I finished the audit, closed the day, and thought nothing more about it. The next night, the same folio was there. Room 209, timestamp 2:14 a.m. Guest name, a single period. Everything else identical. Key still on the hook, room still dark, no vehicle. I deleted it again and logged it again.
The third night, I decided to watch it happen. Instead of running the audit at midnight, I waited. I sat at the terminal and kept InLedger open on the folio screen, the one that shows active reservations and in-house guests. At 2:13 a.m., the screen showed what I expected: the real guests in their real rooms, the vacant rooms listed as available. At 2:14, the screen flickered. Not dramatically. It was the kind of brief flutter you'd attribute to the monitor's age, a momentary refresh. And when it settled, the folio was there. Room 209, timestamp 2:14, guest name, period. As if someone had sat down at the terminal and typed it in that very second. But no one had. I was sitting at the terminal. My hands were on the keyboard. No one else was in the office, and the office door was locked. I checked the key rack. Room 209's key was on the hook. I checked the camera. Room 209's door was closed, its window dark. I checked the parking lot feed. No new vehicles. I walked to the office door and looked through the glass out at the lot. Empty and still.
The highway beyond it a flat black line under a quarter moon. I deleted the folio. I logged it. I wrote, 0214, system-generated folio for room 209 appeared for third consecutive night. No corresponding check-in, no physical evidence of occupancy. Terminal was under direct observation at time of entry. Suspect software fault. Recommend Gerald contact InLedger support. Gerald read my log the next morning. I know because he called me at 2 in the afternoon, which he never does. I see your note about 209, he said. Yes, sir. Third night in a row, I think the system might need a patch or the database has corruption in that room's record. There was a pause. Gerald is not a man who pauses for emphasis. He pauses when he is choosing what to say, which is different and worse. I'll look into it, he said. In the meantime, don't delete the folio. Sorry? If it appears tonight, leave it. Don't delete it. Just log the time and leave it in the system. Gerald, if I leave it in, it'll affect the audit totals. It'll show as a zero-rate cash transaction with no guest name. The reconciliation won't adjust around it. You're smart enough to account for a single folio without letting it break your numbers. Leave it in the system and log the time. He hung up. I sat on the edge of my bed and thought about that conversation for a long time. Gerald hadn't asked me to investigate. He hadn't expressed surprise. He hadn't said, "That's strange," or "I've never seen that before." He had told me to leave it alone and work around it, as if it were a known issue, as if it were something the motel just did. That night I followed his instructions. At 2:14, the folio appeared. Room 209. I didn't touch it. I logged the time and adjusted my audit to exclude it. The numbers balanced without it, the same way they always had, because the folio represented nothing. No guest, no payment, no occupancy. It was a line item for something that didn't exist.
Except the next morning, when I was closing out and prepping for Gerald's arrival, I noticed something I hadn't thought to check before. The folio had a modification timestamp. InLedger tracks every change to a folio. When it was created, when it was edited, when it was closed. The creation stamp was 2:14 a.m., but there was a modification stamp at 2:51 a.m. I hadn't touched it. I'd been deliberately avoiding it, as Gerald instructed. But something had edited the folio at 2:51. I opened the modification log. The change was in the guest name field. It no longer read as a single period. It now read page D. A name. The folio had generated a name for itself 37 minutes after it appeared, while I was sitting 10 feet away. I felt something shift in my chest that wasn't quite fear. It was more like the sensation of stepping onto a surface you expected to be solid and finding it slightly soft. A loss of trust in the ground. I checked the key rack. 209 was on the hook. I checked the camera. 209 was dark. I checked the parking lot. Nothing. I walked to the courtyard door, opened it, and looked across at the West Wing's second-floor walkway. Room 209's door was closed. The windows on either side of it, 208, 210, were also dark. The whole wing was silent. I closed the door, went back to the desk, and logged everything. Then I did something Gerald hadn't told me to do. I went into the back office and opened the filing cabinet where Gerald kept the old folios. He archived them by month, printed out and stapled, going back years. I pulled the binder for the previous month and flipped through until I found room 209. There were entries. Not every night, but many nights. The pattern was immediately visible once you knew to look for it. A folio created at 2:14 a.m., guest name initially a period, later modified to page D. Rate 0, cash, no vehicle, no plate, key never issued. The same folio appearing over and over, sometimes 3 nights in a row, sometimes with a gap of a few days, but always at the same time.
Always room 209. Always the same name after modification. I checked the month before that. Same thing. And the month before that. I went back 8 months, as far as the filing cabinet's archive went, and the entries were there in all of them. Room 209 had been checking itself in at 2:14 a.m. for at least 8 months, and probably longer than that. The archive before 8 months ago was stored in a closet Gerald kept locked, and I didn't have the key. I sat in the back office surrounded by open binders and thought about what Gerald had said. Don't delete the folio. Not because he didn't know about it, because he'd always known about it. He'd been reading my logs and seeing my deletion notes and deciding after 3 days that it was time to tell me to stop interfering. He hadn't wanted me to investigate. He'd wanted me to coexist with it. I could have asked Gerald directly. I thought about it. But Gerald had given me exactly as much information as he intended to, and pressing him would not change that. He was not a man who told you more because you asked nicely. If he wanted me to know something, he would say it. The fact that he hadn't said more told me there was more to not say. So I started watching on my own. The next shift, I set up differently. Instead of sitting at the front desk terminal, I positioned myself in the back office, where I could see both the camera monitors and the terminal screen through the open connecting door. I wanted to observe the folio's creation without being directly in front of the keyboard. I wanted to rule out any possibility, however absurd, that I was somehow generating the entry through proximity or accidental keystroke. At 2:13, I was in the back office. The terminal was visible through the doorway, its green screen glowing. The folio list showed the real guests and nothing else. At 2:14, the screen refreshed. The folio appeared. I saw it from 12 feet away. No one was at the terminal. The office door was locked. The back exit was bolted. I was the only person in the building who was awake. I noted the time and stayed in the back office. At 2:51, right on schedule, the modification should occur. The name change from period to page.d. I watched the terminal screen through the doorway. At 2:48, I moved to the doorway to get a better angle. At 2:50, I was standing in the threshold, eyes on the screen. At 2:51, the folio didn't change. I waited. 2:52, 2:53, still a period. By 2:55, the name field had not updated. I went to the terminal and opened the modification log. No changes. The folio had been created at 2:14 and not touched since. The name was still a period. For the first time in what was apparently months of this pattern, the modification hadn't happened. The only thing I had done differently was watch from the doorway instead of sit at the desk. I went back to the back office and sat down. I deliberately turned my chair so I could not see the terminal. I looked at the camera monitors instead. I gave it 10 minutes. When I came back to the terminal at 3:07, the modification log showed an edit at 3:02 a.m. The name field now read page.d. It had waited. It hadn't updated while I was watching directly, and it had updated the moment I looked away. I want to be clear about the feeling that produced. It was not the horror movie feeling of something jumping out at you. It was the feeling of being in a conversation you didn't know you were having. The system wasn't malfunctioning. It was behaving. It was responding to my attention, adjusting its timing based on whether I was observing it, like a process that needed privacy to complete. I started taking notes outside the official log. I bought a pocket-sized moleskin notebook and kept it in my jacket, separate from Gerald's composition book. In Gerald's log, I wrote the basics. Folio appeared, time noted, no action taken. In my own notebook, I wrote everything else. Over the next 2 weeks, I ran a series of small experiments. I varied my position during the 2:14 window, sometimes at the desk, sometimes in the back office, sometimes in the hallway, once standing outside the office door looking in through the glass. The folio always appeared at 2:14 regardless of where I was. That part wasn't affected by observation. The creation was fixed, automatic, as certain as the clock. The modification was different. If I was watching the screen at 2:51, the modification didn't happen. It waited. It always happened eventually. The latest was 3:34 a.m. on a night when I tried to maintain continuous observation. My eyes drifted to the camera monitors for maybe 90 seconds, and when I looked back, the name had changed. It needed an unwatched moment. But the most unsettling discovery wasn't about the terminal. It was about the room. On the 9th night of my observations, I decided to physically check room 209 during the window. Not at 2:14 when the folio appeared, but at 2:51 when the name was supposed to change. I wanted to know if anything happened in the room at the same time something happened in the system.
At 2:45, I took the master key and walked out into the courtyard. The night was cold and clear, the kind of desert cold that feels personal, like the air is specifically interested in your skin. I climbed the exterior stairs to the second-floor walkway of the West Wing and walked to 209. The door was closed, no light underneath. I put my ear against it and listened. Nothing. The room was silent. Not the ambient silence of an empty space where you can hear the HVAC and the settling of old wood. An actual silence, a complete absence of sound, as if the room were insulated from the rest of the world. I've stood outside hundreds of motel rooms at night. They always have some sound. The mini fridge cycling, the wall unit humming, the creak of the building. Room 209 had none of that. It was the quietest door I had ever pressed my ear to. At 2:50, I slid the master key into the lock. I turned it. The deadbolt retracted. I pushed the door open about 2 inches and stopped. The air that came through the gap was warm. Not motel room warm. Warm like a room where someone had been sitting for hours, where body heat and breath had raised the ambient temperature. The rest of the wing was holding at about 60 degrees. The air from 209 was at least 75. I pushed the door open the rest of the way and looked inside. The room was empty. Bed made, lights off, curtains drawn. Everything in place. The standard issue motel room, identical to the other 31 in the building. But warm. Warm and silent, and carrying a faint scent I couldn't identify. Not unpleasant, not chemical, just unfamiliar. Like a soap I'd never encountered, or a fabric softener that wasn't in our laundry supply. I stepped inside. I checked the bathroom. Empty. I checked the closet. Empty. I checked under the bed, which is something I never do in vacant rooms because there's never a reason to, but I did it anyway. Nothing. The room was unoccupied by any measure I had. But it felt occupied. It felt like a room that someone had just left and was about to return to. The bed was made, but the bedspread had a subtle compression on the right side, as if weight had recently been removed from it. The chair by the desk was pulled out slightly from the table, angled as if someone had pushed it back while standing up. I closed the door behind me and walked back to the office. When I checked the terminal, the modification had already occurred. The name field read Page D. The timestamp was 2:52 a.m., while I had been standing inside the room. I sat down at the desk and wrote in my personal notebook. Room is physically warm when folio is active, shows signs of recent presence despite being unoccupied. Modification occurred while I was in the room itself, suggesting the observation rule applies only to the terminal, not to the room. Whatever is checking in does not seem to be arriving through the room's door. I did not go back into 209 again for several nights, not because I was afraid exactly, but because I needed to think about what I was actually dealing with. The rational explanations were thinning. A software glitch doesn't heat a room, a database error doesn't compress a bedspread, and no electrical fault in the world responds to whether you're looking at the screen. What I had was a pattern. Every night at 2:14 a.m., something checked into room 209 through the property management system.
It arrived in the data before it arrived in the room. The folio was the first sign, the announcement, the registration. Then the room itself responded, warming, subtly rearranging, as if preparing for or receiving an occupancy that had no physical source. Then, at some point during the unwatched minutes after 2:51, a name attached itself to the folio, Page D, and by morning the folio would close itself, the room would return to its baseline temperature, and the only evidence anything had happened would be a line in a database and a note in my log.
It was, in the most literal sense, a guest. It checked in, it occupied a room, it checked out. It just did all of this without ever being seen, without ever arriving in a car or walking through a door, without ever existing in a way I could photograph or confront or verify through anything other than its effect on the systems around it. The question I couldn't stop asking was, who was D. Page? I tried the obvious routes. I searched the name online. There were hundreds of results. It's a common enough name. I searched it in combination with the motel's name, the town, the highway. Nothing relevant. I searched obituaries in the area, missing persons databases, old newspaper archives for southeastern Arizona. Nothing. If D. Page was a former guest or a local figure, there was no digital trace connecting them to this property. I tried the motel's own records next. I went through every archived folio binder Gerald kept, all 8 months' worth, looking for a real check-in under the name Page, a genuine folio with a vehicle and a plate number and a payment and all the fields that indicated a living person had stood at the desk and handed over an ID. I found nothing. The name appeared only in the phantom folios, only at 214, only in room 209. I was about 3 weeks into my investigation when I found the registration card. Gerald keeps a separate file for registration cards, the physical ones guests fill out by hand when they check in. Most motels stopped using them years ago, but Gerald never updated the process. Every guest who checks in during the day fills out a small card with their name, address, signature, and room number. These get filed chronologically in a drawer behind the desk. I'd never had reason to go through them before. I went through them on a slow Tuesday night, working backward from the current month. I was looking for any card filled out for room 209. Most rooms appeared multiple times, normal turnover. Room 209 appeared about average, maybe twice a month with a real guest. I checked each card. Normal names, normal addresses, normal handwriting. Then I found one that wasn't normal. It was filed between 2 other cards from mid-January, about 4 months before I started. The card was for room 209. The handwriting was neat and small, the kind of careful printing that suggests someone who writes formally. The name field read D. Page. The address field was blank. The signature line had a mark on it that wasn't quite a signature, more like a line drawn slowly from left to right, thin and deliberate, as if a pen had been dragged across the paper with light pressure, but no intent to form letters. The room number was 209. The date was blank, and in the top corner, where guests sometimes note their license plate at our request, someone had written a number. Not a plate number, just a number. 214. The time. I held the card under the desk lamp and looked at it for a long time. The paper was the same stock we use for all registration cards, standard motel supply forms ordered in bulk. The ink was blue ballpoint. The card was physically real. Someone had filled it out at some point and filed it. But who and when? If a guest named D. Page had checked in mid-January, there would be a folio in the system for that date, a real one with a rate and a payment method. I went back to the January archive binder. There was no real folio for D. Page, only the phantom ones. Someone had filled out a registration card without a corresponding check-in, or the check-in had occurred through a process that didn't involve the front desk. I put the card back in the drawer and added it to my notebook. I now had 2 kinds of evidence: the digital trail and in ledger, and the physical card in the registration file. Whatever was happening with room 209 existed in both systems. It wasn't confined to the software. The next shift, I did something I'd been avoiding. I checked the camera footage for 2:14 a.m. I'd been so focused on the terminal and the room itself that I hadn't gone back through the DVR recordings to see if the cameras had captured anything during the check-in window. The DVR held 72 hours of footage on its loop, so I could only go back 3 days. I sat in the back office and rewound the courtyard camera to 2:14 a.m. from the previous night. At 2:13, the courtyard was empty. The West Wing's second floor was visible in the upper portion of the frame, the walkway railing and the doors a row of dark rectangles. At 2:14, nothing visible changed. The image was the same. The courtyard was still. No one appeared on the walkway or the stairs. No lights came on. But at 2:14 and about 20 seconds, the image quality shifted. It was subtle, a slight change in the graininess of the footage, as if the camera's sensor had adjusted to a minor light change. I've seen this happen when a light turns on or off nearby, altering the ambient brightness enough that the camera's auto exposure compensates. But no light had turned on. The courtyard lights were the same. The room windows were the same. The only thing that could have changed was something the camera was sensing but I wasn't seeing. I rewound and watched it again. The quality shift was consistent. At 2:14, the footage became very slightly brighter in the area around room 209's door, as if the camera were detecting a presence that emitted or reflected a fractional amount of light. Not enough to see, just enough to measure. I don't have the equipment or the expertise to analyze camera footage at that level, but I know what I saw, and I know what auto exposure does, and I know the camera was reacting to something at 209's door at precisely the time the folio appeared on the terminal downstairs. That night, I made a decision. I was going to be in room 209 at 2:14 a.m. Not outside the door, not watching on a camera, not monitoring a terminal. Inside the room, waiting. I set up at 1:30. I brought a chair from the office, a flashlight, and my notebook. I unlocked 209 with the master key, went inside, and closed the door behind me. The room was cool this time. Baseline temperature, the same as the rest of the wing. No warmth, no unfamiliar scent. It was just a motel room. I set the chair facing the door, sat down, and turned off my flashlight. I waited in the dark. The room was silent. I could hear myself breathing. I could hear distantly the hum of the building's electrical system and the very faint drone of the highway. Occasionally, a truck would pass, and its headlights would sweep a thin line of light through the gap in the curtains and across the ceiling, and then it would be gone, and the room would be dark again. At 2 o'clock, nothing. At 2:05, the wall unit clicked on. Not the HVAC, 209's individual wall unit, the heating and cooling box mounted under the window. It clicked and began blowing warm air. I hadn't touched the thermostat. I'd checked it when I came in, and it was set to off. The unit ran for about 30 seconds, cycling warm air into the room, and then clicked off. In that 30 seconds, the room's temperature increased noticeably.
At 2:10, I heard something I can only describe as settling. The bed shifted. Not dramatically, there was no visible movement in the dark, but the springs made a small sound of compression, the kind of sound a bed makes when weight is applied to it slowly. I was sitting in the chair. My flashlight was off. The room was dark, and I could not see the bed clearly, but I could hear it adjusting, the mattress taking on weight that wasn't there. At 2:13, the desk chair moved, the one by the room's small writing desk on the far side from where I was sitting. It scraped lightly across the floor, maybe an inch, and stopped, as if someone had brushed past it. The room was warm now, warmer than it should have been from 30 seconds of a wall unit cycle. It felt like the room I had walked into on my earlier visit, occupied, lived in, breathing. At 2:14, the phone on the nightstand rang. One ring, then silence. I stared at it in the dark. The phone was a standard motel handset, beige, wired to the wall jack, connected to the front desk system. One ring and done. In the silence that followed, I could hear the open line, the faint hiss of a live connection, even though the handset was in its cradle, as if someone had called the room, let it ring once, and stayed on the line. I reached over and picked up the handset. The hiss was there. The line was open. And under the hiss, very faintly, I could hear typing, the soft clatter of keystrokes on an old keyboard, rhythmic and steady, like someone entering data. It lasted about 8 seconds, then the line went dead. I set the handset down. I turned on my flashlight and looked around the room. Empty. The bed's surface showed a slight impression, a shallow oval on the right side of the mattress, as if someone of moderate weight had been sitting there. The desk chair had moved from where it had been when I entered. The wall unit thermostat now read 72, though I had confirmed it was off when I arrived. I left the room and walked back to the office. The terminal showed the folio for room 209, created at 2:14 a.m., guest name, period. I sat down and looked at it and thought about the typing I'd heard on the phone line. Keystrokes, deliberate keystrokes, entering information into a system that responded by creating a folio on my screen. I thought about what a check-in actually is. It's a data event. A person arrives and their arrival is recorded. Name, room, time. We think of it as a physical process. Someone walks in, hands over an ID, gets a key. But from the system's perspective, the check-in is just data, a record created at a timestamp. The physical arrival and the data entry are two separate things that we assume happen together, but they don't have to. What if something could check in without arriving? What if the data could exist without the body? What if room 209's guest was real in every way the system could measure? Folio, modification, name, registration card, but not real in any way I could see. Or what if I was thinking about it backward? What if the data was the arrival? What if, for whatever D page was, being entered into the system was the same as walking through the door? At 2:52 a.m., I checked the folio. The name had changed. Page D, right on schedule, give or take a minute. And this time, I noticed something I hadn't noticed before. The rate field, which had always shown 0, now showed a number. Not a dollar amount. A room number. 2010. Room 210. The room next to 209.
I pulled up room 210's record in InLedger. It was vacant. No folio, no guest. I checked the key rack. 210 was on the hook. I checked the camera. 210 was dark. Everything normal. But the rate field in 209's phantom folio now pointed to 210, as if the pattern was moving, as if tomorrow night or the night after, the folio would appear for 210 instead of 209. I thought about the registration card I'd found filed in mid-January. If this pattern had been running for at least 8 months, probably longer, and if it had the ability to shift rooms, then it might have occupied other rooms before 209. It might have moved through the building slowly, one room at a time, like something working its way down a hallway. I needed to know where it had been. I needed the older archives, the ones Gerald kept in the locked closet. I'm not proud of what I did next, but I'm not ashamed of it either. I found the closet key. Gerald kept a spare set of property keys in a lockbox in the back office, combination 0000, which he had never bothered to change because he assumed no one would think to try the default. I opened the lockbox, found the closet key, and opened the closet. Inside were years of archived folios, registration cards, and daily reports, organized in bankers' boxes by year. I started with the most recent and worked backward. In each box, I looked for room 209's phantom folios. They were there, going back consistently for about 14 months. Before that, room 209's folios were normal. Real guests, real rates, real names. But room 208's folios started showing the same pattern about 2 months before 209's did. Same structure, same 2:14 a.m. timestamp, same period to name modification, same name, page D. Before 208, it was 207. Before 207, 206. Each room held the pattern for roughly 2 to 3 months before it moved to the next. I traced it backward through the West Wing's second floor, 205, 204, 203, 202, 201.
The earliest instance I could find was room 201, the first room at the head of the West Wing stairs, and it started approximately 3 years ago. 3 years. The pattern had entered the building at room 201 and moved one room at a time down the second-floor walkway of the West Wing. It was currently in room 209, and if the rate field's indication was correct, it was preparing to move to 210. At its current pace, it would reach room 216, the last room in the wing, in about a year and a half. I don't know what happens when it reaches the end. I put the boxes back, I locked the closet, I returned the key. I went back to the front desk and sat down and looked at the vacancy board and the key rack and the terminal with its green phosphor glow, and I thought about a building that was being occupied one room at a time by something that existed only as data and warmth and a name on a card. I thought about Gerald, who had known from the start and told me only to leave the folio alone, who had been managing this motel for years while something migrated through it at a pace so slow it almost looked like nothing. Gerald, who read the log every morning and checked the folios every day and had watched this pattern advance room by room by room and had decided at some point that the appropriate response was to let it happen.
Maybe he was right. The motel was functioning. The guests were safe as far as I could tell. D. Page, whatever D. Page was, occupied a vacant room for a few hours each night and checked out by morning. It didn't interfere with real guests. It didn't damage the property. It didn't do anything really except exist in a space that looked empty but wasn't. The only harm it had done was to my sense of how the world works, and the world doesn't care about that. But there was one more thing, one detail I haven't mentioned because I wanted to present everything else first, in order so you could see the logic of how I arrived at it. On my last night of research, after I'd traced the room-by-room progression back to 201, I went through the oldest registration cards in the archive closet. I wasn't looking for phantom cards anymore. I was looking for a real one, a genuine registration card for a guest named Page who had once stayed at the Saguaro Inn, as a real person, in a real room, in a real way. I found it in a box from 6 years ago, a registration card for room 112, East Wing, first floor. Guest name, Diane Page. Address, a street in Silver City, New Mexico. Vehicle, 2004 Honda Accord, silver. Plate, New Mexico registration. Date, March 14th. The handwriting was the same neat small print I'd seen on the phantom card. The signature was a real signature this time, D. Page, written carefully with the same slow deliberateness. Diane Page had been a real guest. She had stayed in room 112 6 years ago and filled out a card and slept in a bed and left the next morning. A real person who had really been here. I searched her name again that night, more specifically this time. Diane Page, Silver City, New Mexico. I found an obituary. She had died 14 months after her stay at the Saguaro Inn, in a hospital in Las Cruces. She was 58. The obituary said she was survived by a son and mentioned that she had worked as a data entry clerk for the Grant County Assessor's Office. A data entry clerk. Someone who spent their professional life entering information into systems, creating records, making things real by putting them in databases. I don't know what to do with that. I don't know what it means. I don't know if Diane Page is haunting the motel or if some residue of her one night here got caught in the system like a fly in amber and has been replicating ever since. I don't know if she's aware of me or of Gerald or of the rooms she's slowly moving through. I don't know what she wants or if want is even a concept that applies. What I know is this. Every night at 2:14 a.m., someone checks into room 209 at the Saguaro Inn without ever coming inside. And every night, the building accepts the check-in, and the system records it, and the room warms for a few hours, and by morning, everything resets, and the name moves one room closer to the end of the hall. I'm still working the shift. I still run the audit. I still log the folio and adjust around it and leave it in the system like Gerald told me to. I've stopped trying to figure it out and started trying to figure out what it will do when it reaches room 216 and runs out of rooms. Gerald won't discuss it. I've tried twice. The second time, he looked at me for a long moment and said, "The East Wing has 16 rooms too," and then he walked away. I think about that constantly. I think about the fact that the East Wing starts at room 101 and ends at room 116. I think about the fact that room 112, first floor East Wing, is the room where Diane Page actually stayed 6 years ago. And I think about what happens when a pattern that has been moving room by room through one wing reaches the end and crosses over to the other and works its way back to the room where it all started. I think she's going home, one room at a time, one night at a time, writing herself into the only record that still knows her name. And I think that when she gets there, the folio won't close at sunrise. I don't know what that will mean for the motel. I don't know what that will mean for whoever is working the desk that night. It might be me. At the rate the pattern is moving, I've got about 2 years. I bought a second notebook last week. I'm going to need it.